right. Well, it's top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Tyler, since I can see your face, can you give me the thumbs up if you're hearing me? Awesome.
All set.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the February installment of the Accelerant Research Virtual Insights Conference. I am your MC for today, Bill McDowell of Accelerant Research. If you joined us last year for some of our virtual conferences, welcome back. If you're just joining for the first time, thanks. What we have here is basically a series of virtual insights and research conferences that we're going to be conducting starting this month and continuing on a monthly basis through the end of the year. We're going to feature 2 to 5 insights experts sharing knowledge, talking a little shop, and maybe we can all learn a thing or two. So if you did join any of last year's conferences, we have rebranded. So last year we were the Quarantine Virtual Insights Conference. This year we have dropped the quarantine name out of a sense of optimism, hoping that at some point this year we'll actually be able to get to a point where a virtual conference is an optional thing, and we can sometimes get together and meet in person, fingers crossed. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go through, if I can move forward. Okay. If you have joined us in the past, these are not going to be anything new to you, but we've got some groundwork rules that we operate by for these virtual conferences. So we're doing this on Zoom. We're at the mercy of the tech. It tends to take good care of us, so knock on wood that we don't have any issues, but we might. And if we do, we are recording everything. We will be posting all webinar videos after the fact in the archives. So if something craps out from an internet standpoint, if somebody kicks a plug out of the wall, we'll regroup and circle back. So no worries there. Rule number 2: be respectful. This is not something that we tend to have an issue with, but the fact that we are virtual, the fact that we're not face-to-face, there is, in some cases, that sort of tendency to troll or to not be as nice to folks as you would be in person. That's not to say that we can't challenge, that we can't push back or ask hard questions. All of our presenters are researchers for their careers, and guess what? We're used to having to defend our findings and the things that we're sharing. So no worries. But yeah, do be respectful of one another, not just presenters, but also other folks in the audience. Which brings us to rule number 3. The folks in the audience. This is obviously not an in-person series of webinars, but to the extent possible, we do invite you to engage with one another, to engage with our presenters. We've got folks that are accessing from lots of different locations. We've got a Zoom meeting, which is, I suppose, the hub for this, but we're also broadcasting on YouTube, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, no MySpace to my knowledge. But wherever you're coming in from, ask questions. We're going to be monitoring chat on all these platforms. If you do have any comments, questions for our speakers, feel free to float them out there. If you're accessing on social, we ask that you use the hashtag ARVIC, Accelerant Research Virtual Insights Conference. That'll just help us keep track of the questions and the chatter. Let's see, as you can probably tell, we are a research company, Accelerant Research. We're not an event planning company or a professional conference organization. So, what you're going to experience with these webinars has a little bit of lack of polish to it, but that's okay. That's kind of the neat factor that we have going for us. No, what we've got is some really compelling and interesting content. I'm gonna get out of the way in just a moment and let our speakers go ahead and start doing their thing. But what we're starting this month, and we're going to keep on for the next few. We should have some really engaging topics, some great speakers. So really looking forward to it. Just a quick overview of who we have today. Like I said, for these monthly conferences, we're going to target about 2 to 5 webinars. We're going to dip a toe in for this month and start you off fairly slow. We've got Tyler Mangum, who's going to start us off first, and he's going to be followed by Jason Jacobs. We'll get started in just a minute. Did want to give you a sneak preview of, we've already got, a save the date for next month, which would be Thursday, March 25th. Go ahead and mark your calendars. We've already got some really strong researchers already starting to take shape, and more to come. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and step aside. I'm going to let Tyler Mangum, principal user researcher at Oracle, get us rolling with his talk, which I think is going to be very compelling. The politics behind the data. Just an aside for the theme that seems to be taking shape for today is the research stuff that they don't teach you in school. This is the on-the-job training that you have to get once you get in here, and hopefully with Tyler's presentation and with Jason's to follow, we'll make your lives a little bit easier along those lines. So that's it for me. I'm going to step aside, let Tyler do his thing, and I will circle back in a bit to lead some Q&A. Tyler?
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Wait, here we go. You should see some mountains now, and now the deck. So thanks for the quick introduction and overview. And today I'm going to be speaking about politics behind the data, or really the political aspect of what research and what our role is. And I chose this topic because I've seen it obviously across within my role, but across industries, and really just in life in general, but I haven't quite seen a book. It's not something that, like Bill said, you learn in school, and I didn't even go to school for user research, so I certainly didn't learn it there, but it is something you see day to day. And I personally feel that this really can elevate a researcher from good to great, and really change kind of the level of influence you have. So we'll get right into it. But before I do, I'll just give you a quick introduction about myself. Here's me drinking coffee, which I love, but my career path to get here is very non-traditional for a researcher. My background's actually in physiology and sports science. My career started actually with the Seattle Seahawks, where I worked in the sports science department, quantifying player health and working with athletes to try to get them back to normal, essentially, which in football is a tough task to do. Ultimately, I switched over to the product side and the research, where I worked at Microsoft, predominantly on the Xbox One X on the platform, worked at Expedia for a couple of years, and I currently sit at Oracle, where I am a principal user researcher, and I predominantly cover the website, oracle.com, and brand, which is kind of, you can think of it how we visually represent ourselves. But that's my current role. And as I get into this talk, I just wanted to kind of, I guess, speak to what I hear researchers often described as, and that is that we are empathetic, we are data-driven, we are the voice of the customer, we're unbiased, and we're the source of reason. I've heard these things about research, and I am not one to argue against any of them or why these things are important. Specifically, data-driven, I personally think that, our decisions should have data behind them. That's my career. But I am here to tell you that none of these things will matter or do matter if you can't also navigate the soft political elements of your role as well. And to give you kind of an overview or more of an example, I want to tell you the story of my first project at Oracle. And obviously, this is going to be redacted for non-disclosed information, and it's not actually the research topic, but it's the general overview. So when I started Oracle, I was given a question, and this wasn't the question, but let's just imagine it was. I was asked, well, how does Oracle communicate who we are? Again, not the real thing, but it was a large generative question. And I got to Oracle and I was like, man, I don't even really know what Oracle does. That's probably something I should learn first. But ultimately, when you get such a large generative question and you have to start piecing things together, you start thinking about your methods, you start thinking about like, well, okay, let's start getting a foundation. And so, with my physiology background, with my research background, I was like, I'm gonna do the research. I'm gonna put on my science hat and I'm gonna go out and do it. So, I put my science hat on. I was like, okay, I got this, do a card sort, do some interviews, look at different audiences, start to kind of balance left and right, get all elements, do like foundational scientific research. And this is one of my favorite researchers here, so that I throw her in. But ultimately, I got this answer from where we're going, where we've been, where we're going, what we can do. And after about 2 months, it was a really extensive project as a question like this was, this was me after about 2 months. I was like, okay, chin up, I've got this. I'm going to tell everyone like my findings. And it was, exceptionally data driven. It was objective. And I came in fresh and new with a new perspective on kind of what Oracle can be. But in the background, a little bit of reshuffling going on. It was actually kind of more like a lot of reshuffling. A little bit of VP changes. The person who requested this project is actually getting moved to a different role. But that's okay. I mean, the data is the data, right? It's just ultimately something that can speak for itself. So I made the decision. I said, well, okay, I'm still going to share it. It's really good data, and it's very objective. You could argue points, and there are flaws, of course, but ultimately it should be shared. So I went to the VPs and I said, okay, here's where we've been, and here's where we can go. And the VP got this data, and it was, mixed results for positive and negative things that we've done in the past. And she's like, no. Larry Ellison, who's our owner, he decides this. He makes this decision. And I was like, okay. And she's like, well, if you want to tell Larry Ellison that what he's been doing for 40 years is, either wrong or different from what our intended goal is, like, you can, but I would not recommend that. And I was like, oh, well, so my mood changed a little bit. I was here, I was like, well, this project lost its sponsor. It lost the political aspect. And I kind of sat on it, and it has since been resurfaced, but at the same time, for months, it was very much kind of a moot point. And was interesting because, this was me. I was all of these things, but the project and the delivery and the political element, it didn't land. And it's really key to acknowledge those steps and the flaws. And today I'll be speaking to the key takeaways that I'd like for all of us as researchers, or even those who work with researchers, to understand, to navigate the elements that's not just being data-driven, that's not being unbiased or empathetic. It's much more than that. And with these kind of takeaways, my hope is that we come together to kind of deliver or make the most impact, obviously, that we can, given the political element of our job, which is not just saying a result, but being strategic in the ways that you do and embedding within teams as you go. So to start, the first foundational problem that I ran into with this project, and likewise within any industry, any role that you'll face, is that we need to understand how decisions are made. That's within your company and within specific projects as well. But in the example I just gave, there was a higher level decision that was made that I didn't quite understand the relationship. And each company looks quite different. Each role and each research role and each project you work on has different levels of involvement and different levels of takeaways that you'll probably see. But you as a researcher, or those who work with research, do need to understand. You may see something straight out of a UX textbook, like the classic double diamond approach, where you actually do research and you use these findings to define what you're making in the design, and it circles back and it's iterative or it's agile or whatever you want to call it with a fancy business term, and you go forth and you make a solution. That's pretty textbook. Oftentimes it could be a smidge more complicated. This is not terribly different of a diagram that we work with when a decision's made, or your owner could be directly involved in this. And that's okay too. There's going to be projects in which It could be Larry Ellison deciding, and that's where it's at, or it could be ones that you have a much more traditional UX approach. But it's incredibly important to understand this, because understanding these politics of how a decision's made helps you understand how to best integrate your research and ultimately approach a problem in the way that you're capable of kind of optimizing for. So to do this, it really starts with internal research. It starts with being a scientist, but within your own stakeholders or within your own teams and within really kind of all elements of kind of who you work with. You need to understand how decisions are made, how practices overlap, how different teams design and pair together, who's involved ultimately. And knowing this, that really is politics. That is understanding who to go to and when and where and why and who has influence. And that's really key. So I'm a firm believer of setting aside on your first roles, or even if you have not done this yet, within the first week, 2 weeks, even month of your practice, is learning how a decision is made prior to, maybe in combination with how to do the research, the actual work part. But this is really important to interview your own team members, just so that you understand kind of what their problems are at and their relationships with others. And when I first started working as a professional researcher, I suppose, at Microsoft, one of the first people I worked with gave me a metaphor to understand, and I'm going to kind of stick with this metaphor for a little bit, so hopefully this makes sense. But he said that relationships and products, and I specifically worked on a product at the time, but it's kind of like a flower. So I know that seems weird. Roll with me for just a little bit. But at the center of a flower, or a piece that kind of connects all the petals, is usually a product manager. And a product manager's role is ultimately to connect different practices to traditionally kind of help along with whatever the product is. So you can think of the whole flower as a product. And within this, you have petals, and petals are your different practices. And obviously there's some overlap. You have research, you have design. Traditionally, these are thought of as your closest partners. You have data science, dev, marketing, finance, whomever, but all of you come together to create whatever you're helping create. And ultimately, each company has a different structure. It doesn't traditionally look like this, and it's not even different companies, but different teams within the same company could look wildly different. There could be a much more simple structure or complex. And each petal might represent a different thing in terms of how a relationship is made. But ultimately, we need to understand how these overlap. Traditionally, like I said, research and design are thought of as the closest partners, and that might be the case. We often do design research where we actually just test the design, and when we evaluate it, we give the results back to design. But it's much more complicated than that, in my opinion. It's certainly where product and PMs can play a very central and integral role to helping connect the dots for other practices. And understanding these relationships really gets you a solid foundation of kind of how to navigate who to deliver results to and why. And it's ultimately important not only to understand how these relationships work, it's important to understand what defines success for each practice. Does everyone align to the same success? And how does that relate to your business? And I know some companies have different success metrics for different things. So for example, I won't name which company, but I know a very big one that defines success for engineering as the amount of things that they put forth in the world. And so that really incentivizes just getting things out. It doesn't necessarily mean that getting perfect things out. It doesn't necessarily mean doing your in-depth research, but ultimately, once you understand the relationships and what defines success of the role, you can start to understand how you can best help those who you work with. So understanding what makes success of these different branches and different teams is critical, because then you can understand how to integrate within those decisions and ultimately the politics of kind of how you're working. And what I like to say with this data that we provide is that we traditionally, once we have data, we obviously have directional data of, well, we have a desired outcome, or at least we have, recommendations. We get these results and we say how, or potentially how to make it better. So we try to connect it, but ultimately our goal and how I think we can be the most impactful is understand everyone's relationships to this desired outcome. So how does data affect, you can think of these as different practices, maybe engineering or design or whomever. How does data affect these roles? And ultimately, how does it come together? And this is why understanding how decisions are made matters. It's really because it's important so that you can understand what makes everyone successful so that you can embed and ultimately help them as much as possible. That's being much softer in the skill, but comes from that foundation of understanding the relationships and what defines success for them and your business that you work with. Now, sometimes you may look at the process and it doesn't quite look right. Maybe in your perspective, it looks a little bit more like this. So I'm sticking with the metaphor, so we're still rolling with it. And you might, at any level, whether you're the owner or partner, whether you're an IC1 just starting, you might recognize, hey, maybe this isn't the smoothest process. Maybe I see that people are looking over. And honestly, everyone has a different perspective. A new VP can come in and say, let's shake it up. Or you could start to build out your own practices, the first researcher at your company, and you need to kind of help shape and change it. It's really important to note that you don't need to do this on your own. Everyone wants maybe a healthier flower in this sense. Maybe everyone recognizes that it's broken, but we can go about doing this in a very savvy and political way in that sense. So changing a process is incredibly difficult. It takes obviously time, connections, and ultimately experience in which, if this is your first role and you're just starting as a researcher, it's very difficult to say, I know what the ideal situation is. And ultimately, this being my third professional role, I've seen what's worked well at other companies. And I'm not going to lie, it's very helpful to understand what has worked and has not worked in the past. But ultimately, the goal is to help maybe shape this a little bit more. So talking a little bit about the techniques to change a process, or at least be a part of the process to help make your role a little bit easier. The first is to understand, obviously, the perspectives and needs as I was speaking to, but this integration is key. And integrating in a team is no small undertaking. Traditionally, research is thought as either one of two models, an embedded model or a service model. A service model is where you get a request and then you go out and do the request and then you give the results, and that's kind of the end, and you go to your next service. That is much harder. That's to integrate in the team because by design, you're not part of them, you're acting as a service. But embedding and integrating and understanding those steps is really the first step in a sense to kind of understand these processes and understand these perspectives and understanding the relationships so that you can identify when to help. So that's really the first step, in my opinion. The other thing we can do as research is to show the value of your work. You don't always need to just say, I can do this, or I think it would be important to add a study or to get data. You might get pushback on timing, and it's important to obviously not block these people as much as you can, maybe sometimes it's necessary, but showing the value of why research is important and ultimately relating it back to the success of the business is one of the most key elements to help integrate and change a process. So that relationship back to the team and team individual goals and business goals is very difficult to do. But if you can successfully, if you can share and show that your insights helped the business, then you've obviously secured your role pretty foundationally, but you'll get more and more requests, you'll get more and more integration, and you'll get a better understanding from others into how to leverage kind of what you do and who you work with. There are are some key things to avoid when trying to start up this rehydration or this, evaluation, this change of the process. And the first major hindrance, I should say, or major stumble that I've seen, and I'll give you a quick story from this, is to try to convince a team of their needs without explaining why or understanding the process. And I'll give you a story from a very technical company from a friend of mine who's a technical PM, and they had one researcher on the team, and he was building a very technical thing, very back-end system. And she asked him, the researcher asked him, the technical PM, have you thought about the user experience? And his response, and he told me about this because, I'm a researcher and he's working with her for the first time. He said, it doesn't matter. Like, why are, the researcher went forth and tried to, not explain why this either could matter or how this could help, but she ultimately also didn't understand the way that these people made decisions. And this is very risky to do because you might end up alienating yourself, where you might be perceived as an extra step. You might be perceived as this person who doesn't understand how I make a decision. So why should I leverage what you have to say? So it's really critical to not say, hey, you need research here. It's much more important to understand the decision process and understand how you can fit in that sense prior to setting sail on your own. And that brings me to my next point of like, research is not the centralized point. It can help guide the points, but ultimately it's really not the way in which we work. We are partners. We are helpful. We do not, direct, or we can, but it's traditionally a team. And it's my firm perspective that we integrate as a team, or we work together as a team. And that's being very savvy about how you do it. So these, setting sail on your own, you can obviously do the research on your own, but just saying, I'm just going to do this, and not explaining or not getting buy-in can be a pretty big mess. So once you've integrated, understanding within the process, you can ultimately start building a map. And you can ultimately say, okay, well, if you're going to make these kind of decisions, here's where I can help. And you can adjust to the timelines. And there's going to be times when that's not possible. Sometimes, this turnaround time's a day and a half, and it's just something that's not scalable. But ultimately, you can start building these relationships of yes, no's, X, Y, Z's, kind of like saying, okay, at this time, here's the kind of work that I can do. And then people that you work with might have a very good understanding of how to leverage data and how to be crafty about it as well. And that's the key takeaway. Ultimately, you can build something fun like a Gantt chart. This is very similar to things that some people on my team do. It's starting to, I'm not sure if you can all see this, it might be a little small, but you can actually block out time for being research. And this, just getting on a timeline and a map prior to a product getting out is a pretty big step, in my opinion. And to do so, to get to this point, to have them understand where they can leverage this and why, is many months of work and trust and understanding the process and embedding as well. It's not just that they say, okay, you need research. It's much more than that. So understanding the process really allows you to identify when you're needed. And being reactive is, so next level research is not really answering the questions that you're asked. Obviously, you need to do that as well, but that's what's called being reactive, and that's reactive research in that sense. But ultimately, being proactive or identifying questions, identifying when you're needed independent of the ask. You still may be asked things. That's really taking that next level leap and understanding that process throughout. And that really allows you to be the most effective as possible. Ultimately, you will need to do work. You'll need to do your research. And this talk is not about methods. I'm not really a methods expert. So I'm just going to say, do solid work. We'll get on to the more fun parts after that, but it's to really be sound and be confident as you do it. You're the experts. You do what you do. I'll skip this slide, or I'll skip this section just because there's other methods experts, I'm sure, on this call. The next key takeaway is that we need to so we've done the research now, we need to scale and adapt to our audiences. And each audience may look slightly different. You could have something like this with your product team. You could have a research team meeting where it's just researchers. You could have different levels of involvement from different executives. Maybe some people are missing. But the key thing you need to do and ask yourself is, what does my audience need to take away from this report? This is key. This is being strategic in a different way. You've already done the work. And it's really key to also set the stage appropriately for whomever the audience that you're working with is. So I skipped ahead, but set the stage. And I'll give you a quick example. And if anyone on this call knows me very well, you'll know I'm a huge Portland Trailblazers fan. So I'm gonna roll with another kind of good example. So not all presentations and recommendations need to be the same across all audiences. So to highlight this, I'll give you a quick example of some data, and I'll give you a bit of context as well. First of all, Damian Lillard, Dame, is a professional basketball player for the Portland Trailblazers. Shooting from beyond the arc, which is this line here, it's a kind of slang. It gets you 3 points instead of 2 points if you shoot within here and score the bucket. And when you're playing basketball, you can take a shot 2 different ways. You can catch and shoot, so someone passes it to you and you shoot it right away. Or you can go off the dribble, meaning you create the space yourself. It's more difficult to do. And Dame last night, who also hit the game winner, just saying, was 6 for 8 from the catch and shoot, or sorry, from the being off the dribble. The league average is 34%, is very impressive. And I'm telling you this story because I assume most here are not familiar, at least to this level of depth, with the NBA in general, and I'm giving you a lot of context. But if you're someone like, I think someone on this call named Jared, who might be in the audience, and I were just chatting, I would say something much more like, well, Dame went 6 from 8 from beyond the arc with all attempts being off the dribble. That's my whole slide. It's the same data. It's just different context. It's the same story, but a different way to say it. And that's because I'm actually just recognizing and being crafty and political in the ways that I'm presenting my story. You do not need to tell everyone the same thing in the same way. And you can actually take your data from your reports and shift them and shape them in a very savvy way so that you can deliver the most impact. And it all comes back to the question of asking, what does my audience need to take away? And there are things you can change within the same data to adapt to your audience. And just one last shout out to Dame. He should be the MVP this year. But variables you can change from your audience and adapt include context, tone, details, delivery, and relevance to the partners that you're working with. And all of these things really depend on who you're presenting to. But in team meetings, I can see, I've seen those who don't give enough context because, I'm not part of a product team. I need a little bit more, a little bit more background, as I gave you with that story about Damian Lillard, or maybe a different, tone might be applied. I could be a bit more formal when I speak to an exec, but when I'm talking to my product teams, I could really just just talk the real talk, I suppose. And everything really matters at the level of relevancy to the partners that you're working with. So scaling and adapting different ways. And ultimately, the main thing that you can do as a researcher is say what you need to say. And this is something that I've actually adapted as I've grown in my career. I'll give you 2 examples of the insights that I, used to write, or examples in general, which is, at Microsoft, I would say something like, 3 out of 6 were unable to discover a button. And, I know low N usability issue, 50% reflects the population, blah, blah, blah. Not just that 3 out of 6 doesn't sound too bad. But now when I write an insight, when I'm at Oracle, I just say, this is a problem. It is. Both pieces of information are saying that it's a problem, but one's being a bit smarter in a way at delivering it, and one's being a bit more impactful in an ideal way that can be relatable. And that's more of a politics soft side. That's much more of an interesting tidbit of information that can be really impactful, and that will influence how you work in general, or how your work lands, I should say. And one of the final takeaways that I see or often see a big miss from researchers is that we fail to empathize with our stakeholders. We fail to understand their perspectives. And we traditionally are really good scientists. I keep bringing this up. We're very data-driven. Many of us are extremely introverted, like myself. I love, just being in my own reclusive bubble. But ultimately, we don't understand the perspectives of where our stakeholders are coming from, and that's key as well. It's not just understanding their perspectives. We always empathize and are very careful with the way we phrase our questions to our customers. We try to not lead, but we should do the same when we work with our partners as well. And ultimately, I think Bill brought this up at the very beginning of this talk, was that you may get pushback. We get lots of pushback with our results. And anyone who wants to push back on any of these points, feel free to bring them up. That's part of my job. And you might get questions like, can you really know that? Well, analytics say people do click on this. When I used to work, we did these kinds of studies. Like my favorite ones, like, I don't think this is true. I've gotten all of these probably within the last week or two. They're pretty common, but ultimately, my perspective, that political aspect, is to not push back immediately and not say, well, actually, Nielsen Norman describes 3 out of 8 being as a significant issue, and I'm pretty confident because I'm the method expert. That is a big miss in my humble opinion. There's softer political ways to navigate this that I think we should all start with as a foundation prior, or at least once we get this kind of pushback. And the first thing that I like to do is take a group first mentality. It's to take a step back. And generally, we all have the same goals that we align to. We're all in this together. You might, in your career, get one person who's just maybe not, but it's very uncommon, and everyone has individual success. This relates back to the first point of understanding what success is, but we have the same goals. And generally, your partners are not out to get you. If you get pushback and saying, I'm not sure that this is true, or like you didn't use enough people, it's not a personal attack on you. It's just, perhaps a temporary disagreement. So first, we understand our partner's perspectives, and that's fairly key. And when I get pushback, or when we do research in general, there's really 2 kinds of mindsets that you can approach with. And this is actually a takeaway, that a businessy term that I took away from Microsoft that really did land, which was approaching a mindset from a fixed mindset, which is not what I'm recommending, or a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is one where you only do things one way and that it's the right way, or a growth mindset is seeing the problem as a challenge and an opportunity to learn more. And a growth mindset, like research, there are not easy, simple answers to get, or simple methods to get like the answer. There's usually a variety of ways you can come about approaching the problem, and likewise working with stakeholders. And ultimately, even when I interview candidates, I ask exceptionally hard questions with no correct answers. And that's the majority of tech interviews in general. But one of the main evaluative tasks for me is to understand, can this person that I'm interviewing or speaking to understand, multiple approaches? Can they take it from a perspective of maybe they're not the only right, there's not a single right way to do things? And that's a good foundational question, because I think this is really key for researchers to approach a problem or a perspective in multiple ways, and that can help really elevate your research as well. So when I do get pushback, or even before I do, there's a couple techniques I like to use when staying empathetic with my stakeholders. And the first is that I like to predict the questions, especially if I think that there's a sample size problem, or at least that I could foresee that others might think that there's a sample size problem. I like to addressed those before. And so I love calling out flaws and biases of my own work. In fact, I use this technique at the start of this talk. I showed you an example of when my research didn't land, when I wasn't political. And that is really key because it helps instill trust of like, oh, I understand that, you recognize that there's more points to this, that there's more elements that you can actually navigate, or that, your research isn't a single truth. Maybe it's part of the same, coin. There's multiple elements. And if you recognize that, then I, as a stakeholder, understand really what's important, what the takeaway that you're trying to drive is, and that's pretty key. Also, staying flexible is really key as well, and not saying that your results or your research is the foundation. I mean, it very well might be, but that flexibility and mentality is really key as well. And then keep everything in the picture. I keep bringing up this point of how it helps others or partners is really drives that empathy, because then you understand what their success is and you relate it back into ultimately helping. And that's very crafty. That's very, it's not just saying that there's a problem, but saying there's a problem and how it helps the people that you're working with is exceptional. Ultimately, there's going to be disagreements. And one of my favorite techniques to use is just saying, that's a great question, and I'll circle back with you offline. If all else fails, like I had an SVP say, essentially it was a usability study that I did. And she's like, well, it would have been better with 50 participants. Most people on this call know 6 is fine. And I said, great, I'll circle back with you on that, but let's just keep moving on. And that person was like, okay, that's fine. But ultimately, we didn't quite circle back on it. I mean, the results really landed, and we changed the product that I was working on with the results that were shown. But if there is a very big pushback, don't elevate this in a meeting. You can always circle back if all else fails. One thing I took away from my last manager, a term that he used, which actually really kind of resonated with me, was to celebrate that you have found something, maybe incorrect, or you found a problem in your own products or your own work. And by celebrating and saying like, this is a good thing, it helps change the perspectives of those that you're working with as well. Because ultimately, people, engineers, marketers, designers are making things, and you are effectively, maybe not directly, but effectively tearing it apart, helping other people be judgmental on it. And that can be really harsh to hear. But instead, and many, most that I work with, don't take personal offense, but some might, that their hard work isn't understood. It's not approaching it in that way of saying, well, that was bad. It's saying, it's a good thing we found this. And that's really a change in mentality. And it's just the way you deliver an insight as well. And the last point in this section, or second to last, is to establish trust. And this entire talk could be on this point. So I'm not going to go into how to establish trust, but ultimately it comes with time, it comes with quality work, it comes with relationships, and it comes with the demonstration of impact. And this is a very common interview question as well, is how do you establish trust? There's no right answer. This whole talk could be on this. Lastly, with empathy, and this is a surprisingly big miss that I see in many researchers amongst their careers, is that we in general need to be kind. It can only serve you for the better. And this just doesn't go with your delivery of your insights, but just in life in general. One of my first mentors, I'm not sure if he's on this call right now, but he was, a principal at Microsoft at the time. I was working, just starting my career as a contract, and I reached out, and he was one of the very few people to say, let's grab a coffee, let's sit down, let's just chat. And from that, we've made a lifelong kind of connection, and I still seek to him for mentorship. But ultimately, in a practice that I use today with my stakeholders, with my PMs, with design, it's not just asking about the products that they're working on, it's making sure that they're doing okay, as 2020 and 2021 has brought us. It's making sure that you're connecting on a different level, because that helps establish trust as well. ultimately, the last kind of in summary and making sure I'm good on time, I think I really am. It's to apply these, not just in research, but in life and beyond. And I've seen this everywhere I've gone in different elements of, academia, in my many weird professional careers. But politics and levels of influence really kind of reign supreme in kind of how everything works and integrates as your jobs and as your functions. Even understanding how a decision's made amongst your professors really helps you understand what to deliver to them. Likewise, in any role that I've worked in, it helps you kind of build this process as you go. So these standards I've really seen across industries. This kind of like the main takeaways from this were to understand the key needs of those who you're working with, understand how decisions are made, do good work's pretty important. Don't just make things up, although I have seen that, but probably don't do that. Establish trust, adapt to your audience. And of course, my favorite is to be kind, be inclusive, be the person that you obviously want to work with. And it's that last point will speak more to politics than really anything else that I've said, or in as much as anything else that I've said. So those are really kind of the softer skills, the overall summary of kind of what I've navigated through my career. And it's something, again, that I just don't see us talk very much about, can really help influence those we work with. So at this point, I think that was actually, no, that was my last slide. And I wanted to make sure that if we have time for questions, obviously none of this is rooted in anything else but my experience and those that I've worked with and seen. So I'm happy to follow up with questions, happy to just open up a conversation floor to talk about what's well or what's not worked well in the past. But ultimately, I really think that these can help influence kind of how you can do your job and how you can be the best person you can be. And that, I think, was my last slide. So that's all I got.
All right. Very nice, Tyler. Anybody has questions for Tyler, feel free to submit them now. We have had a couple of comments that have come in as you were talking. First one was from Kim, and I love this analogy, especially as a Cavs fan.
Ooh,
Perfect way
yikes.
to share stories to your audience. Yeah, I hate you all, both Cavs and Blazers. You have rings. I'm a Charlotte Hornets fan, and I'll never know what it's like.
The Blazers were in the early 70s. I can hardly count that as a ring
Hey,
for
it still
myself, but
counts.
I suppose.
All right, we've got a question from Priya, which is, how do you keep yourself accountable?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think all of these principles come with a level of introspection. All of these, being kind or recognizing your own biases, really just you have to keep yourself in check in that sense of kind of continuously asking yourself, are you recognizing that you're maybe not understanding how a decision's made, maybe not understanding this process. But ultimately, my favorite technique to keep myself accountable is trying to predict my own biases, trying to predict where my flaws are at and what my research is not delivering. It's to use an analogy, in chess, you really have to predict not what you're trying to do, but what others are trying to do. And so that recognition of what others are doing or how they're kind of behaving in that sense, that's really more important than what you're trying to deliver, because it's not just you taking an attack, or in chess you kind of moving forward, it's what others are doing as well. So it's really trying to recognize what others are doing, or how they're behaving, or what questions they're bringing up, or what challenges they're bringing, and that keeps myself really grounded, and keeps my research grounded, as well as delivering those insights that matter. So just not keeping scope on myself keeps myself accountable in that sense. I hope that makes sense.
Nice. Let's see, we also had a comment from Catherine on techniques, excuse me, for changing process. I'd add shake hands and kiss babies, which I love. to extend the politics
maybe
metaphor.
not this year.
Well, yeah, true that. Bump
Maybe next year.
elbows and blow kisses to babies. I don't know. I
Maybe
work in a
next year.
complicated environment with a lot of business stakeholders without a direct connection to specific research projects. Research is a final addition to the product design process here. So I use these encounters to share a peek behind the curtain and treat everyone in the business as a future stakeholder. It's really helped extend our reach into some great strategy conversations.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that ultimately comes down to, you know, to extend the metaphor, that every flower and every decision and petal is different amongst different companies and agencies. If you're working in an agency, it might be a much more simple and less political structure in the sense of kind of who you're working with. And what the delivery and the ask is. It could be that you're only working with the clients and they demand things, and that's a much different way to approach it, and a much more binding way, I suppose, than working at a big in-house like Oracle. But hearing just what you're doing is the right steps. It's what else can you do in that sense? But it's different amongst companies and a lot of different challenges.
And I personally, I really loved your commentary around, be empathetic, be kind, understand your stakeholders that you're working with internally. I've always found it amazing that as professional listeners, we often suck at listening to the folks around us. Especially, you can't always control the news that you're given in your research, and sometimes you're delivering bad news, but understanding, who you're delivering it to, what they're up against, if they poured their heart and soul into something, you do want to have an understanding of that, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's see, last check to see if any other questions have come through. Don't see anything. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left before the next presentation. So perfect. Just gonna give everyone an opportunity to grab a coffee or hit the restroom. We will go dark for a few minutes and then return at the top of the hour. Tyler, thanks so much. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you all for attending.